Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on a beautiful spring day in New Haven for our second event in the series Women Theater Archives Conversations, hosted by Beinecke Library. My name is Melissa Barton, and I'm curator of drama and prose for the Yale Collection of American Literature at Beinecke. We begin by acknowledging that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquian-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. Women Theater Archives Conversations is an online series we are hosting in conjunction with the exhibit Brava, Women Make American Theater, about which you can learn more at a link I will post momentarily. I'm trying to do this in real time, so there it goes. And it was just announced today that Beinecke's exhibition hall will open to the public with advanced reservations on weekends beginning soon. Hooray! More details will be forthcoming on Beinecke's website, so please keep an eye out for that. The series explores how archives might enable, thwart, connect, and reject us from the rich past of women in performance. As our previous speaker, Danielle Bainbridge, put it, archives expand the story of what we consider theatricality, but they also represent a distance from the theatrical event that can itself raise intriguing questions about the relationship of archives to real life and of our present to what is past. Danielle's extraordinary conversation last month with Kate Bredesen is available on Beinecke's YouTube channel, and I will put a link in the chat to a page about the speaker series that links to that video and shares details about future events in a little bit. Today, it's my great honor to be joined by three amazing colleagues who have held highly varied roles relating to the stewardship of theater archives. I'm going to give just their very briefest of bios now, and I encourage you to look further for yourself into their extraordinary careers at your next opportunity. Ken Cerniglia is a veteran dramaturg, writer, creative consultant, and organizational leader. His dramaturgy includes the Broadway hits Hadestown and Peter and the Starcatcher. During 16 years as dramaturg and literary manager at Disney Theatrical, he developed over 70 titles for Broadway, touring, international, and licensed productions. Ken is past president of Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas and co-founder of the American Theater Archive Project. He holds a PhD in theater history and criticism from the University of Washington. Eric Caleri is the Klein Curator of Theater and Performing Arts at the Harry Ransom Center, an international humanities research library, archive, and museum. He serves on the boards for the American Theater Archive Project and the Theater Library Association, and is a lecturer in the Performance as Public Practice program in the Department of Theater and Dance at the University of Texas at Austin. Tiffany Nixon is the archivist for Roundabout Theater Company, a position held since 2008. Roundabout Theater Company archives contain extensive institutional and stage documentation chronicling the company's history as an off-Broadway and Broadway producer. Her focus lies in documenting the processes of live theater so that future generations of scholars and practitioners can contextualize the work through open access to the archive. She is a board member of SIBMAS and an adjunct at NYU Tisch Production and Design Studio, where she teaches a research and resources course to tomorrow's theater designers. The four of us are going to converse for the next 30 minutes or so, and then we will open it up for questions from the audience to close out the hour. We invite you to share your questions in the chat. I'm going to begin by asking each of our panelists to briefly describe the context of your work as a steward of theater materials, and we'll go as you appear on my screen. So we'll start with Tiffany.
Thank you, Melissa. And I think there's going to be some strange sun that comes in because I'm in my office, but I want to thank you and Beinecke for inviting me here today. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't throw out a huge shout out to the now retired Susan Brady, who was an archivist at the Beinecke and was really instrumental in stewarding collections over many decades. And so I think we all stand on her shoulders. So I just wanted to start with saying that. As Melissa mentioned, I'm the archivist at Roundabout Theater. I think for people who don't know about Roundabout, Roundabout is a very large not-for-profit theater in New York City. We operate 4 different theaters, 5 different stages, doing big musical productions and to really small off-Broadway productions that are new works, new musicals, that kind of thing. I really do think that, my work as an archivist here is looking at the arts administration of a big theater company. So all of the records that are coming in speak to that. But from a research standpoint and from my own personal interest, I really do focus on the production records and providing deeper entrance and contextualizing sort of the behind the scenes records that often don't make it to repositories or collections for a variety of reasons. They've been weeded, they're confidential, whatever you want to label them. My interest is really in teasing out those records and finding entrance so that people in the future can really look at those records. I think that this conversation, really my work in particular here, is in direct conversation with the earlier panelists, Kate and Danielle. I think that what really resonated in that was hearing about this gap and filling gaps and finding gaps in the record. And as scholars and researchers looking to archives to fill that void, how are we as archivists and stewards of these collections, what role do we have in making sure that those gaps get smaller or that they're filled in with really important records? It's that, to me, is people joke, but I lose sleep at night thinking about what are we missing and what can we tell more about, and how do you reach out to directors and different collaborators and creative teams to make sure that they understand that we are celebrating them, that we want to tell this story in a way so that tomorrow's practitioners and scholars can really find entrance. So it's really important that we all work together to build these stories and to flesh out these collections. And I'm really excited to be in this conversation. So thanks.
Thank you, Tiffany. We're so excited that you're here and can't wait to hear more about everything that you do. Eric.
Hello, I'm Eric Caleri. I'm the curator of the Performing Arts collections at the Harry Ransom Center. The collections and performing arts date back to the 11th century all the way to the immediate present. I'm working with people in the theater community to preserve their personal and professional papers. So playwrights, designers, directors, performers, producers, stage managers, any sort of area of performing arts. I work with my colleagues here to get the collections processed and cataloged, and then we promote their use to students, artists, and the general public. So it's really important to us that the material that comes in is made as broadly accessible as possible. So it's being used for papers, it's being used for books, it's also being used by artists who are interested in creating revivals of plays and musicals, folks who are just generally curious too about the collections. So that's really important to us. Basically, I'm the in-house specialist in performing arts. So I handle reference questions, I consult on conservation projects, I teach classes, I serve as a performance history specialist for media outlets, and I organize exhibits and programs around the collections here. And most recently, I've been working on an international collecting initiative, the Theater 2020 project, which is documenting the impact of the pandemic on the performing arts community. So it's a lot of different things under the umbrella of curatorship.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, and I hope you'll talk more about the Theater 2020 project and just everything as we go along. Ken.
Hello, everyone. I'll apologize in advance. Sitting here at the window in New York City, and there's like sirens, and so I'm going to be managing my mute button. I'm Ken Cerniglia. I come at archives from many different points. I'll be the first to say I'm not a professional archivist, but an archival sensibility infuses me. I first came into sort of major contact with theater archives as a graduate student in theater history and criticism. I got my MA from Catholic University of America, my PhD from the University of Washington in Seattle. So having contact, the School of Drama had its own small archive, and using that for some of my work as a scholar, asking important questions about theory and history, and using and investigating archives to support some of those lines of inquiry, but also discover new things in the archives. And so starting to, think about, when I'm going into an archive, like who put this box here? How did it get here? Why is it in this order? Like what are the things that these archives are telling me as a user of archives, as a researcher, as a historian trying to go in. And one of my specialties is theater historiography, not just like, what history can I write? What stories can I tell? But how do we tell these stories? How do histories get written? What are the questions that go into it? Periodization, all of these things. And so, historiography is always in my brain too. And then I continued to be a theater artist, even though I was a theater scholar and studied that. I found specialty in the field of dramaturgy. And one of my first professional gigs was an internship at Arena Stage when I was in my master's program in the literary department there. I was a literary intern. I was a dramaturg at 2 of the shows in that season I was there. And the literary department had show folders for every show. So everything that the literary department generated. So there'd be a script in there. We'd save programs, we'd save notes, any of the research we did around a certain production, we would save. And so like every production, we had these cabinets at Arena Stage sort of in random places, but we knew where they were. And if the theater had produced a show before, we could go have access to that sort of like literary folder, that dramaturgy folder, and see what was in there. What did people in our position before do around this show? So I had experience there being a user of an archive inside a theater company. So not just in a repository in a library, but inside a theater company too. And was oriented to, how can archives serve artists and ongoing and theater staff? And so that's what that seed was planted as well. When I did my PhD research, a lot of the bulk of it, even though I was living in Seattle, I came back to New York and availed myself of the Billy Rose Theater Collection at New York Public Library when they were redoing the building. So it was in the annex, like way out on like 43rd in New Jersey. And it was really cold when I visited. I'm a California boy. So I was very dedicated to those archives. But one archive I used in particular was that of like many boxes of a turn of the century actor, Walker Whiteside. And I had a hunch as I was diving into some of these boxes, like I might be the first researcher to unpack this box since it was packed. And that sort of connection to an artist who's long gone sort of lit me up in terms of like how these things can come alive, why it's important to preserve records. Well, I don't know why some of these things were in some of these boxes, but as a researcher, I'm like, how did you put these things in this box? And how do I not ruin it as I was there, but also feeling like very responsible as I was diving into like wanting to preserve it, wanting to take care of it, letting other people know what was in here, because the things I had questions about, there were many more records than the things that I was pursuing, and I wanted other people. So I was getting excited about that then. When I finished my degree, I thought I'm going to be a college professor. That's what I was studying for. That didn't happen. I ended up getting a job making theater, coming back to New York and working for Disney theatrical productions for 16 years, as well as doing some other work. And there I was sort of back into a literary department at a large theater maker and generating a lot more records. So here I had been a user, and then both as a scholar and as an artist, a user of archives. Now here I was in a position of generating a lot of records of process and product. And because we didn't have on staff at Theatrical an archivist, I had already that sensibility. So sort of like found myself, and I realized a lot of my colleagues who were literary managers and resident dramaturgs were sort of default archivists, because we're managing sort of context and text of theatrical productions, and we're thinking about saving some things because we're researching and generating at the same time as part of how we practice the theatrical art. And so soon I got involved in co-founding ATAP with American Society for Theater Research and Theater Library Association and Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas, sort of bringing these organizations together to see if we could start to gather resources, do some experimentation to help active theater companies, theater makers, start to, in a systematic way, preserve the records of process and product that they were generating for fellow artists, for future researchers. But mostly these would be on premises. And then to start to develop, which we'll talk about today, conversations with repositories. Because anyone who makes theater knows like there's always limited space and limited time. So how do we form partnerships to preserve these records so we can continue making art, but also in the future have some of our records available for other people who will ask questions about what we did, just as I asked so many questions about what Walker Whiteside did at the turn of the 20th century. I think I'll end there for now.
Thanks, Ken. It's a really great segue into our next question. I mean, I love an archival sensibility infuses me, and I guess kind of one question is like, how do you infuse people with archival sensibility in general? But by way of asking that, the question is, what are effective strategies for preserving theater and performance records? And you all have already talked about kind of different ways that happens, and sometimes these things are being preserved in place in the context of a company organization that's actively using the records. Sometimes they're considering those records going to a repository. Sometimes as Tiffany says, kind of intervening at the point of creation to make sure that something gets saved. So in that whole spectrum, what works, what doesn't work, and what are some complications that might make it more difficult to get those records? Who would like to begin? Eric, go.
Eric can go.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about any sort of production, there's tons of documents that get produced usually. There's scripts, there's prompt books, media recordings, reviews, rehearsal notes, production reports, rehearsal reports, contracts, budgets, you name it. There's any number of different kinds of documents. So one of the bigger questions, I guess, is not just what's being created, but what's being saved, and is it being organized in any sort of meaningful way? Who's attending to that? Is anybody paying attention to sort of gathering that together in a meaningful way? I think performance is a profession that's long operated on a contract basis, I mean, for centuries, and sometimes, even longer. And so even at large theater companies, you have quite a few folks who just come in to work on a single production, and then they leave. And sometimes they take their documentation with them. So by the time the show ends, its run, folks are usually off working on completely different projects by then. So the time and attention isn't being given to making sure that the records are being preserved. And it can be time consuming, and if it's neglected for a long period of time, it can be really labor intensive to sort of gather all this together and organize it. It's not impossible though, and there's ways and strategies, and we'll talk about that too. But frankly, labor is not something that theater companies usually have in abundance. So it's something that you really have to commit to as an artist and as a theater company, that actually recognizing that the records are important to you and they're important to posterity is a big thing. And so when I reach out to theater companies about their archives, whether it's in my position here or with the American Theater Archive Project, which I also work with, I frequently find that there isn't actually any one person on staff who's responsible for this material. Marketing usually keeps the record separate from the artistic and administrative staff, education and literary usually doing their own separate things, and the stage managers, who are really like the unsung archivists of many different productions. They're sort of doing their own thing independently in communication with all the different departments, but it gets really messy. I would say too, on the institutional side, performances archives are really also hard to collect. They don't usually fit uniformly in document boxes. They have every type of possible material you can imagine. They have paper, film, photography, paintings, puppets, set models, textiles, plastics, metals, things that you need sort of special attention to. And that gets, it makes it logistically harder to plan for and preserve, which is important, which is why we do it, but it is harder to sort of make the plans. And, there's not-for-profit theater, and then there's nonprofit libraries and archives. Nobody's making money off of this. Everybody's sort of struggling with labor and fundraising and all that kind of thing. But it's about sort of finding those collaborations where we can help each other out.
Thanks. Did you want to jump in, Tiffany?
I do. I think we can't stress enough. I mean, when we're talking about all of this work, how rare it is to have an archivist working within a theater company. And I think that if you're talking about how do you step in and really start to, cohesively, collect the content, make sense of the content, start to really reach out to the various creators to get the content and make any kind of sense of it, it's very, very rare. And yeah, there will be dramaturgs, there will be stage managers, there will be general management folks who will step in and try and keep these records. But really, if you have the ability to hire an archivist, someone who can really come in and make sense, even if it's just short term or project based, so that you can have somebody coming in and creating a system that is looking at what happened in the past and then creating guidelines for what happens into the future, so that you're really not, my, consulting, I too have long been connected to ATAP and have gone in and consulted with many companies. And it's that moment of like, well, how do we start? I mean, we've been in business for 25 years and there are like 80 boxes of material, and it's that flustered, like, moment. And I always say that those boxes are there. The boxes are okay. Let's think about how you're going to move forward. And with ATAP, when it was in its, early years, I really did pull, the most comprehensive stage Bible that we had at Roundabout. And I made a checklist and said, this is the kind of content that you as a company producing this work should start to think about. And you may not get all of it, but if you get most of this material, you can guarantee that you're providing context into the show in a meaningful way. And if you can build on that checklist and as an individual company start to pull in other items, then you're on the right path. I mean, I cannot tell you how many times I've gone into theater companies and they open the drawer and they happily show me all of the playbills. Yeah, that's great. That's one kind of archive, but it's content that lives in the world very readily. And if you really want to provide entrance into your work, the playbills are just one part of that. You really need to have artistic process. You need to have decision making. You need to pull back that curtain to show why things happened. And I think we could talk a lot about how makers don't want to pull back the curtain. They want to just show you the final product. The messy rehearsals and the fights and all of that, that's not part of the process. But as we all know in this room, it's a huge part of the process. So there are many layers that you have to consider. And each company has its own set of layers. So it's complicated.
Yeah, so to that point, I mean, for anyone, I would love to hear you say more about this kind of question of an archival sensibility. And if you think that that ever gets in the way of collecting records that might document a process that was a little messy or, for whatever reason, if people have too much in mind that everything is being saved for posterity, what kind of an impact does that have on the collaboration?
Sure, I'll talk a little bit about that. Just remind me, I'm trying to remember like who said it in terms of like how many playbills should I save? Like 1 is essential, like 3 is sensible, and like 5 or more is hoarding.
5 is crazy,
right?
yeah.
Like 5 is crazy, right? Like that's too many, particularly like as the internet is holding a lot of records of the kind of things that we produce. When I think about the sensibility, I like to share my passion for the archives, and apologies for the siren coming through. I like to talk about like, oh, I was here, I helped make this, right? A lot of the work that we do as theater makers, whether even the product is ephemeral, the process is even more ephemeral. Like what we did today is like gone and vanished. And I have some colleagues who are like really good about like doing voice memos, recording every single conversation that they have, and they can access it, they file it really well. And like, there's tons of work that I do is like, I don't even remember what happened, right? But it advances the project somewhat. But it takes so many hands to make any sort of production of theater, and along the way and as you put it up. But I think everyone, we wouldn't do this unless we loved it. There are many better ways in the world to make money than doing theater, right? So there's a love of it, and sort of attaching that love of why you do what you do to that kind of archival sensibility of like, let's preserve some of this, if not for our own memories and for the people who come after us. And there's many reasons, and it's tapping into kind of the stakeholders in a given organization, in a given production, like who benefits from this now and in the future. And a lot of times, a theater company will be like, let's start an archive because they're coming up on an anniversary, a founder's retiring, there are all these sorts of things like, oh, we kind of need this. Let's grab this kind of stuff because we want to promote what we've done. We have a legacy here to preserve. So figuring out like who all those stakeholders are and why should we preserve what you've been working on, you know, for now, so we can have access to it, but also for the long term. So, and all of us have worked on American Theater Archive project and the manuals and the resources that we offer. But one of those things is some of it's just dollars and cents. Like if we come up with a sustainable system now for like with a line item in the budget and every department saves a little bit of something, this is how much money we're going to save later when we're not scrambling to like put all this stuff together because we'll have access to it. So sort of saving time and money is part of it, but really tapping into the love. Like, you know, you're spending a lot of time making the theater now. If you could spend like this much more time, and we'll give you a manual like for how to do that, to just save these things, these items, and maybe we'll have a conversation about it in a year. And maybe we'll like ditch some of those and save other things because we found that's more in tune with our mission.
Yeah, I want us to talk a lot more about ATAP, but before we do that, I wonder if you could all talk a little bit about the what role personal papers might play in your advising for Tiffany, or in your collecting or in your research. Like, are we thinking only about the records of companies, or are we thinking about personal papers too, and how that kind of fits into this landscape?
I mean, certainly the mission for Roundabouts archives are very much Roundabout centric. And so the individual papers of various executives at Roundabout, those are being captured in different ways than the general institutional records. And certainly we are keeping that, and I'm actively, it's not as if someone leaves Roundabout and their records go with them. In the case of Roundabout, the records would stay at Roundabout, and we would, box that up and inventory that content so that anyone who's coming into that role would be able to pull those records should they want to review them, but they won't be intermixed with the records that are going to be created moving forward. So there's a huge sense of keeping those kind of records. I think that through the years, I've gone back and forth with thinking about asking for full sets of records from, say, costume designers or various people who have long been connected to the company. And as an archivist, this is where my, the archivist mind kind of kicks in, where I would actually sooner see the collection kept in whole and deposited at a repository for open access than to piecemeal Roundabouts materials out. And in the early years of my being here, I did go after a lot of the records of creators that Roundabout didn't have for a lot of different reasons. I mean, I think Ken talked about it and Eric talked about it. So much of the records and thinking in theater companies are 5 years into the future. They're not thinking about, oh gosh, we should keep all of the renderings from this show because we may want to, refer to them at some point. No, they're not thinking about that necessarily. So I did go after a lot of the past visual materials from shows so that we could more contextualize our productions. But when people have come to me and want advice on their collections more in whole, I will usually direct them to New York Public Library or the Ransom Center or another fitting repository, because unless you're somebody who really was connected to Roundabout your entire career, we're not really, the mission and our collecting policy is not to take in those collections. My work outside of Roundabout, consulting for different companies and individuals, is very different than what I do here, but I follow the same principles. I try and keep materials together. If I'm going to help that artist place a collection someplace, I want to do due diligence to make sure it's the right repository. They're going to provide the kind of access that that artist needs and wants. I mean, we've just skimmed the idea of copyright, and for so much of this work, copyright is the hindrance when you're looking at materials and you're a producer bringing in a variety of different artists, playwrights, different people that all have rights assigned in different ways. And then you have the unions and all of that on top of it. It can be debilitating to figure out how to go through all of those rights to really provide access to the materials. So lots of what I do is really thinking about the rights and how can you secure or release rights so that you can provide entrance to scholars and just anybody who wants access. So there's a lot of different pieces of it. And I wear different hats depending on what work I'm doing. But here at Roundabout, it's very Roundabout centric.
Yeah, that's so helpful to hear about kind of how you're thinking about it in the context of Roundabouts records, especially, but even in the advising aspect, you know, for our collections, the theater collections that are at Beinecke kind of sit mostly within the Yale Collection of American Literature, which I'm the curator of, and so they are mostly collections of personal papers, you know, of playwrights, and then also collections of companies, mainly the Theater Guild, which is an enormous, the largest collection in our collection. So but we tend to work more with people who are placing personal collections of papers. So it's an interesting contrast. I do want to turn to talking about ATAP's work and just more generally about kind of what people have to weigh when they're thinking about stewarding their records in place, you know, in the context of a company where they can easily be consulted by the company moving forward versus placing them in a repository where they might not be quite as accessible. They can't be taken out to be shown to people and that kind of consulted and that kind of thing. And I wonder what you all think are kind of some of the pros and cons of those different approaches.
Do you think you lose something about that sort of proximity when you place an archive at an institution? There's something about being able to keep the archive with the theater that helps it become sort of more active and alive, and you can sort of quickly just draw on it for different kinds of programs. When it's placed at an institution, oftentimes you can't pull material back out of it. Sometimes you usually will. I would always recommend that theater companies and artists have a sense written down as part of the agreement about how they will have access to the material. If they can request scans of material, how many scans can they request at over a certain period of time? You know, those are really important things, and it should always be in writing. But it's always been my philosophy that collections should be, if most accessible, they should be accessible to everybody, but they should especially be accessible to the creators, the people who made it themselves. It needs to serve them. It needs to be a source of creative inspiration. I think of someone like Arthur Miller, for example, who you know, wrote diaries and notebooks for most of his career, and then in the mid 90s was going to go back and do an edited version of his journals. And as he started doing that, he started discovering all of these ideas of plays and stories that he had thought about like in the 40s and 50s, but had never written. In the last, you know, 10, 15 years of his life, was creating these works that were based on ideas in many ways that he'd already had, because the archive was there to support him. And that's really important. There's so many different ways that the collection can support the creators, but that decision to place it within an institution also has its benefits. It does create a sense of access and preservation and a sense of posterity for this material to make it much more widely available to audiences than perhaps than it would be at the institution. For researchers, especially, to go from a theater organization to a theater organization to another, you know, it's a lot of work, and oftentimes theater companies that do preserve their own archives don't even share that information on a website that material's there, or they don't know who to contact. So there's a lot of benefits to transfer that material over, but I think it's definitely it's an institution by institution, case by case basis, and there's a lot of different things to weigh.
Yeah. We have, in a minute, I want to open it up to questions from the audience. I have so many more questions, so I'm trying to choose one more to ask you all. And I guess, this is something we were talking about a little bit before we began the session, but I would love to hear more from everyone. Ken, you mentioned a kind of hard numbers that you could show someone that it would benefit you to get this stuff in order now as opposed to later, you know, because you know, we can prove that, you know, as a fiduciary matter, it's going to be better, right? But what are some other benefits that organizations and or individuals stand to gain by kind of having a sense of their archives when they're not even thinking necessarily about placing them in a repository? How do they benefit from that? What do they stand to gain?
There are a number of things. I mean, internally, of course, just to have access to things, mostly because in most theater companies, there's a good amount of turnover, right? Like founders may stick around, people with certain positions may stick around, so you have that institutional memory. But in many departments, people move around. Theater people move around, they get new jobs. You know, there's just turnover in theater companies, and so to have good records, like each department having good records, a company having good records, so the next person in a given position can build on what's come before instead of start over. Like it's very common in theater companies to just start over because you don't know where things are and it's a new way in. So that's one, of course, just saving time with limited resources to sort of keep good records, keep good archives in the theater inside the theater company. Another one has to do with access to grants, right? So if your company is starting to build a legacy over time, and you can point to that, you know, we did these things. This is what these seasons look like. If those things are pulled together in a sort of easy to access format, and you can, you know, literally like bring up, you know, what were our seasons? Who are our artists? What was the mission of the company? What is the mission of the grant that you're applying for? How can you connect those dots? Having those archives in order saves money, gives you access to more grants. And also, you know, what I was mentioning before, a lot of times when theater companies get interested in archives, when like a founder retires, or there's a gala, or there's a big anniversary, like that's a lot of labor to put that together. If people aren't spending all their time hunting for things that could be kept in some kind of order with good access, that saves you time as well. But also just having a sense, like the companies that have a better sense of their legacies are able to, on their websites, because, you know, we can put some things up as long as copyright is cleared, to, you know, like this day in history in our company 10 years ago, those sorts of things. Like audiences enjoy that. They love to be participating and supporting theater companies that are building a legacy, that have some kind of a track record. It's hard to create theater. It's hard to keep companies' doors open. So the more that you can show, like there's a foundation there that we're continuing to build on. We're having a continued conversation with our past as we look toward the future. That all, you know, can be boiled down into dollars and cents that can support a company going forward.
And certainly, I want to tie in some of the questions that I'm seeing post around social media and, you know, assets, digital assets, and all of that content that is coming forward from these companies. If you have the ability to hub or centralize all of this content into an archive or to some kind of, you know, digital asset management system where you're keeping all of your production records in one place and you're, you know, foldering all of the content that is being created in support of those productions, when and if you want to pull those for a social media post, or, you know, a milestone, or to send all of the show art to a donor, you know, all of that content is really at your fingertips. If you're, you know, classifying it in such a way, I'm using language that came in the post, if you're organizing it and describing it in such a way, it doesn't have to necessarily be a database where you're ingesting all of that content into a database. It could really just be a foldering system on the servers, or however you're keeping the content, where you're organizing it in such a way that someone or various someones can access content and very quickly turn it around. I mean, in my case at Roundabout, I think that what made this project so successful was that I could very quickly turn over assets to people. If you needed a photograph, if you needed show art, if you needed the script, if you needed anything in support of any part of your work, they can ask me and I quickly turn it around. It saves their time, it saves everyone's time to be able to do that. And I mean, I think that I would push it back to Eric to talk more about capture of social media, since he was so, you know, nicely and successfully doing that over the pandemic. I think that we're all doing it in various ways. And when I consult companies and they're looking to place their collections, I want to make sure that it's institutions and repositories that can very aggressively and well handle digital records. So I'm going to pass it to you, Eric, for you to talk about that, if you will, if you can.
Yeah, I'll also say that connected with that, there's some really interesting work being done by theater companies to think beyond the archive. And I really, or to think of the gaps in the archive and how to address them. And that to me is also really exciting work. My job is to collect and to sort of to make these conversations happen, make connections. But I think theater people are storytellers by nature, and I want to enable and encourage theater makers to tell their stories themselves. And so when a theater company like Fusebox Festival here in Austin, Texas, a major international performance company, they were saying, you know, one of the things that we're noticing that we don't have represented in the collection are A, the voices of the artists themselves beyond the production that they're working on, and B, the voices of the audience members and their sort of reactions to these pieces. So they came up with two different projects. One of them was that they realized they didn't have any time with the artists except when they were driving them around to different locations. So they started interviewing them in the car and it became a sort of a program podcast that was not only a document for the archive, but then something that they can share as an extension of their promotion and social media platform. And then when it came to audience participation, being able to encourage people to use social media hashtags to be to really actually create like response booths at venues to say like, okay, you just saw the show. Do you have like 2 minutes to give your initial sort of reaction to this? It helps to be able to add to the voices within the collection. So I'll just throw that out there too as a ways that people are thinking creatively about the archive and in addressing gaps.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that it's so, those are such creative approaches, and it's so important to kind of try to be holistic while also remembering that a lot of these formats present real challenges for long-term stewardship. So digital media, social media, it's very hard to archive those proprietary media, and in the same way that it's hard to archive things that don't fit in document boxes, as Eric was alluding to earlier. So we had a question reminding us that the exhibit that this event is in honor of and the event itself has women in the title, and to maybe talk a little bit about any differences we might perceive by gender in terms of the creation of theater records and also their stewardship. And I don't know if anyone would want to take that on. Eric.
Happy to, yes. Oh my gosh. So I will say that historically, most if not many theater collections around the world were often started by women. Women were originally the ones who were doing this kind of work, the labor of collecting around performing arts. Anecdotally, I'd say also women are usually the ones who I see organizing theater collections, and yet women are less likely to reach out to archives and libraries about their own papers. And this is one of the real challenges for institutions, is that the people who think about preserving their work and the people who think about organizing their archives are usually white men of a certain class who sort of feel like their work needs to be saved, and they see that their peers who are also white men are also being saved. And so that's an issue on our part as institutions, but also within the theater community to say, yes, your voice matters, absolutely. And how can we support your efforts to archive your work? 83% of librarians and 53% of archivists are women in the profession. And 70% of theater tickets on Broadway that are sold are purchased by women. Women are a huge part of theater and a huge part of libraries. And they're also underrepresented in theater archives, just as they're underrepresented within the theater profession. And this is something that absolutely, as part of the Theater 2020 project, as I'm collecting around the pandemic, and there's a lot of important conversations happening around racial and gender equity within the profession. And this is what we're really interested in collecting too, is these conversations, which are happening in tandem and in some ways in response to, but ignited in many ways because of the pandemic. So I think I'm happy to hear that and see these conversations taking place, and we're glad to be documenting it. Yeah, so I think I'll put that out there, and then hopefully my colleagues will also share some of their thoughts.
Thanks. Ken, were you going to say something?
I was just going to pitch in, it's a really interesting question, because everything around archives that I've ever done, I've been like mentored by women and work with women predominantly, as sort of Eric has shared, and that, most of the participation in ATAP has been women. And so, I hadn't thought so much about how the archives that we're helping to create and support, if they were gendered in any way, or if sort of our system of making archives in any way sort of contributes to systemic oppression, and if so, how can we identify those things and make like theater archives a vehicle for systemic liberation? But I do think we have to talk about it more, and we obviously, need to count, and we need to think more deeply about these questions of, if women are predominantly the ones engaged in the theater collecting and the theater purchasing, but are underrepresented in the theater making, how does that shift? How do we take that and start to make that shift? I mean, we are engaged in a lot of these questions and looking for some systemic change, and really looking at, seasons, not just like who's on stage, but who's in the room making these decisions. But then how does that then come and relate to the archive? What are the questions that we're asking? Any kind of like looking back at history, making new history. I talked about, my investigation in historiography. A lot of it's like, it's not that women weren't there making theater, it's just that they didn't have the controls on the stories that we're told about the making of the theater. And so these recovery projects in history are dependent on records being available in the archive. And so we have to make sure, as we're building our archives now, that they're not at the exclusion of any groups, whether racial, gender, or otherwise. So we really have to, because we're in there and saving these things, this is about legacy. So we have to make sure we're asking and answering these questions appropriately and doing our best to change things that are unfair.
I think you also have to look at the history of the archives profession and this idea that you're meant to be a neutral or absent bystander to the history, that you're there as this person who happens to be documenting it, but you don't provide opinion, you're not supposed to, employ biases in any way. It's meant to be this neutral telling. And I think that, a lot of scholarship over the last 10, 20 years has teased out the reality that that's not so. If there are women that are behind these collections, they're the ones that are processing, describing, providing entrance. They're looking at these records through a specific lens, and that it's you're not doing anyone any service to say that it's a neutral and or absent person behind these collections, that there is a person. I mean, in my records, I make a very clear note to say, this is provided by the archivist, and I am the archivist, and it's not just like where I don't provide opinion, I'm actually providing an opinion. And I talk about this a lot with people, where I get very worried that, let's say if a new show comes in and I'm very excited to be in the room and, to have the sense of the embodied or the embedded archive in these processes, where I'm providing the same context and excitement than I would for something that's on the main stage that is maybe more in the public domain and there's more research on it and I don't have to provide as many new entrance points. I think that there is a sense that you are biased to different kinds of things. And the more we look at these archives and the more we understand the women and the people behind them, the more we understand the why and what of what's making these collections move forward into the future. I mean, certainly from Roundabout and a lot of the big producers that have looked at the last 2 years with Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement and a lot of the shifts that were happening prior to that, but now definitely in response to White American Theater, We See You, and a lot of the narrative that's in the world around diversifying and creating more inclusivity in theater, big companies really want to be responsive to that. And at Roundabout, Refocus, and a lot of the work that is happening is in direct response to that. And luckily, I'll be able to capture that content, make sense of that content, and then turn it back over to the public for research. And I think that playing an integral role in making sure that those records move out into the future is really rewarding, and it makes my work feel very meaningful, for sure.
I see Eric has just posted in the chat some a link to some resources that ATAP provides for taking care of your own archives, and then also this webinar that is coming up in April, right, Eric? Yeah, which is very exciting, and so keep an eye out for that. I'm going to post a link to our page that has links. The video of this chat of this conversation will be on there. Danielle and Kate's conversation from last month will be on there, and then the next conversation, which is going to be with the staff of the founding staff, and then the current leadership of Native Voices at the Autry, and the archivist, the head archivist from the Autry Museum. So that will be really exciting to hear them talk about the archives of Native Voices at the Autry. I am looking to see if there are, oh, here's a new question. The question, let me just read it, one sec.
Can I ask a follow-up question to Tiffany?
Please go ahead.
And Eric too, and all of this. So obviously, right, like the archival work is not neutral because human beings are involved in it, making decisions of what goes in and what goes out. If we can, agree that that theater practice in this country has a history of sexism and oppression, is there like a feminist archival practice? Right, like sort of moving forward and sort of like engaging the work. Is there a way that the work itself, not reaffirming the sense that like it's neutral or that there aren't biases involved, but is there a more proactive sort of activist archival practice that we could engage in moving forward? What does that look like?
Yes, absolutely. I think, for example, at the Lesbian Her Story Archives in Brooklyn, which is one of my favorite archives in the world, it's an institution I wrote about quite a bit in my dissertation on LGBT archives in the United States. And I think it's brilliant. They have made it a policy of theirs that the collections are held in a home space, and this is always the case, and that there needs to be a lesbian who lives on site at all times, that this is about proximity to living people. It's a living history. This is also not about academics. This isn't about people necessarily coming to do research for books, but that it's set up specifically so that women, for example, could bring their kids on their lunch hour and read lesbian love letters from the 1930s while they have a sandwich. And it's about learning more about yourself and your place within society, more than it is about necessarily working on a book project or something like that. So there are absolutely practices of structuring archives, archival spaces, about thinking how one accesses the space that certainly challenge the sort of patriarchal kind of models that have been part of libraries and archives for centuries. I think there's a lot that needs to continue to be done, but I'm very happy and proud to think about how archives just within the last 20 years have done so much, 20, 30 years have done so much to be much more accessible, especially to folks who are not necessarily credentialed academics. A lot of institutions used to require that you have letters of recommendation and you write letters of application to even be permitted to look at material. A lot of places are moving away from that and recognizing that these are collections for the humanities. These are all of our shared collections, and we all benefit from learning from them. You don't need to be working on a book project for that.
And also, I mean, if statistically women are the people doing the work as archivists and in many cases librarians, I think one of the best ways that you could push this forward as a feminist agenda is to hire a bunch of archivists to work in these collections, to really, I mean, it can be a hybrid dramaturg archivist type person, but really put your money where your mouth is, really invest in the resources to hire the people that can do the work. You're lifting up women by doing that if they are the people that are doing the work. Women can come out from behind the scenes to really put their voice to these records and to really talk about the collections in meaningful ways. And certainly by being invited to these kind of discussions where the people that are doing the work and that often are never talked about, tease them up and raise them up so that you're creating a feminist agenda just simply by shining a light on them, I think. So, and I used to live down the street from the Lesbian Her Story archives, and it's amazing.
I think a major takeaway from this conversation, is that archives and libraries and theater share in common that there's a lot of hidden labor in them and a lot of under-recognized labor, that often that labor is performed by women, and that we should do more to recognize that labor and really buy that labor if we're going to live in an economy where we have to buy all of our labor, so that we are making sure that work gets done in an honorable way. And I mean, I think that's a major takeaway that I hope we get out of today's conversation. And turning to takeaways, I wonder if anyone has any last thoughts that they want to share before we sign off.
Keep your stuff. Don't
stuff.
worry about how you're doing it or why you're doing it. No, just if you're a maker or if you're somebody who is thinking about theater, making theater, there's value in keeping those records, even if it's just like a simple running of the script and the reasons why you did things. Keep it. I think that there's no harm in filling a box with material and looking at it in 5 years to see what's of value, what's not of value. Don't get too bogged down in process, just start to capture it.
And to follow up on that too, you're not alone with that. For those artists and those companies out there, know that you have help, know that you have organizations like the American Theater Archive Project that actually my colleagues at other institutions, Melissa, myself, folks at the New York Public Library, at Ohio State, at Harvard, there's folks at each of these institutions in roles like ours that are there to be able to offer assistance and suggestions, and feel free to reach out to us at any time. Yeah, I do thank you, Melissa, for mentioning the labor behind all of this. It isn't unsubstantial. A collection of maybe 150 boxes or 100 boxes can take an archivist over a year full-time to go through it and process it and make it available. That's full-time labor, and that's a lot. And when it comes to your own archives and you're looking at it and you're like, well, I don't have a whole year just full-time to be able to work on this, it's okay. The work of archiving is cumulative, and the work that you do now is work that you don't need to do later. And just staying on top of it and starting somewhere will make sure that that material is accessible in the future.
Just bringing it back to my story that, and to support what Tiffany said, like, keep your stuff. Like, you don't know if someone who's in your position in a theater company 5-10 years down the line will benefit from the stuff that you kept, or someone 100 years from now who's just curious about, like, how did they make theater in the early 21st century and what did it mean to them, right? Like, those things are valuable, those records are valuable, someone's gonna care. So keep it and reach out for help about how to organize it and where ultimately it goes.
To the three of you, I have to say, I can't tell you what an honor it's been to be in your company today. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing so much wonderful insight with our audience. And yeah, thank you for the work that you've done and have done and continue to do in this field. It's so important. We're grateful to you. And thank you everybody for joining us. And we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.